Benjamin Skolnick, who is the archaeologist from the city of Alexandria, Virginia, as our guest speaker tonight. Just to give you a little bit of background, he serves in the Alexandria's archaeology division. They have several archaeologists. He specializes in landscape archaeology, digital mapping, and GIS. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and anthropology from the College of William and Mary, and his master's and doctoral degrees in anthropology from the University of Maryland, College Park. Before coming to work for the city of Alexandria in 2015, he was the associate director and lab manager of archaeology in Annapolis. Dr. Skolnick's work includes managing the city's archaeology digital atlas and research of maritime history, 19th century plantations, and landscapes of enslavement and the domestic slave trade. We are very fortunate to have him with us this evening. We're going to very quickly, I'm going to stop sharing and allow him to share, and we will begin our presentation. Once again, really thrilled to have you joining AHS for the event tonight.
Thank you for having me. Give me a second to make sure I get everything on, share. All right, Kathy, can you see that?
Yes, you should be all set.
Perfect. All right, so my name is Ben Skolnick. I'm an archaeologist for the city of Alexandria. And one of my many duties is to deal with all of the maritime archaeology that's in the city of Alexandria. And so for anybody who's not from the area or just moved here, Alexandria is just to the south of Arlington. The history of your county and our city are intertwined, going back to the beginning when Alexandria was founded, I guess. And so this talk, I had a couple of directions to choose from when laying this out. And I think the one that I decided to go with was to just walk you through some of the archaeology that's been done on our waterfront over the last 40 or maybe in some cases pushing 50 years now. And so one of the best ways I found to organize this is to keep coming back to this thing here. This is an 1863 bird's eye view of the city. It was done during the American Civil War. And what you're looking at is the Potomac River there in the foreground. That's King Street there front and center, running all the way to the top of the frame. So that's this one here. Duke Street is 2 to the left. Coming up this way, Cameron. I haven't been to the city in a long time and I forget all my streets. Cameron, Princess Queen, and then Pendleton and Orinoco up this way. And so the first point I wanted to make is the history of Alexandria is inextricably tied to the Potomac River. And the second point I want to make is the Potomac River has moved over the last 250 years. So what you're looking at now is a map from 1845. It was done by a man named Maskell Ewing. Ewing was here during the 1830s and 40s, and he was an engineer. And what he was working on was the construction of the Alexandria Canal, which connected Alexandria and by way of Arlington to the C&O Canal up at Georgetown. And part of being an engineer building the Alexandria Canal is he drew us a bunch of maps. And this is one of my favorites that he drew, if only because it's actually 2 separate maps. What you've got is down here at the bottom is the 1845 shoreline of Alexandria with all of the piers. And actually he labels the names of all the piers, which is actually super helpful for us. In a little while, you'll see some newspaper advertisements that historic newspapers that I use frequently to do work on the waterfront. And the number of times that somebody names a wharf and I have no idea where this wharf is mind-boggling until you have a key like this that tells you the names of all the wharfs. But the other piece on Ewing's map here is an older 1749 map. There's actually a couple different versions of the map. If you look at this line that cuts back away from the water, this is the original shoreline of Alexandria when it was founded in 1749. The best known version of a map that shows that shoreline was done by a young 17-year-old kid named George Washington, who at the time was the assistant to the deputy regional county surveyor, whatever his job title was. He got started as an assistant to the surveyor for Fairfax County and assisted in drawing these lines. Library of Congress has a copy of that map, and various versions of it make it into the Alexandria deed books. There's one in the Fairfax, their book is called The Record of Surveys. But it's this earlier shoreline that is probably the most important to our talk here, because when you look at Ewing's map, it becomes obvious that there's about 10 or 13 or 15 blocks here in now downtown Alexandria that weren't there in 1749 when the city was founded. And so what we find time and time and time again is on these blocks, we have the buried remains of an early 18th and 19th century waterfront. And so I'm going to keep coming back to this bird's eye view and sort of navigate us up and down the waterfront. This is sort of the core of Old Town. The Lee Street site is here. It's sort of across the street from what's now the torpedo factory. If you go there today, the first couple floors are parking, and then there's condos above it. But back in the 80s, it looked like this. And what you're looking at is it's an active archaeological site, and dealing with all the kinds of things that you deal with on a large city block wide archaeological site down on the waterfront. So I'm looking at vacuum pumps and drainage problems, soil retention problems. And so what they came down on this block, which if you go back and look at the map again, is not on the waterfront today. It's a block and a half off the waterfront, are the remains of mid 18th century wharves. You can see the construction of one of these wharves here. They've essentially just taken felled logs, notched them, and piled them together almost exactly like Lincoln logs. It's the same idea. And what's happening is throughout the second half of the 18th and into the first decade or maybe two of the 19th century, Alexandrians are doing most of that filling along the waterfront that Ewing shows us in his map, this one here. And there's a couple of reasons behind it, not to get too far into it, but number one is they're trying to reach out to the deep shipping channel. Here at the Potomac, it's probably about 3/4 of a mile or to a mile wide at this point, but the deep water navigable channel comes right up against the shoreline within a couple of feet, maybe tens of feet. And so if you're an early Alexandrian and you've got waterfront property sort of back in here on the other side of what was then Water Street, which is now Lee Street, you either need to pay somebody who's down here at one of these 2 points to use their dock or their pier to get your cargo onto an ocean-going ship. You could build a several block long pier all the way out, or you could get yourself a rowboat, put a couple of barrels or hogsheads in a rowboat, row out to a ship that's in the deep water channel, load it up, get back in your rowboat, row back to shore, and repeat that process 50 or 100 times until your ship is loaded. And so they quickly realized that if they just take dirt and rocks and whatever they had on hand, throw them into the river along the waterfront, they can build their property out closer to the water. There's a fascinating series of legal decisions that go all the way back to English common law, and a couple of interstate compacts between Virginia and Maryland that sort of pin down how Alexandrians could use the waterfront. And it doesn't help that the original land grant to Maryland basically told Virginia that we don't have a shoreline on this side. It belongs to Maryland. And so that's one reason. The second is that if you've got waterfront real estate in Alexandria and you have a business and you want to expand, you can either turn to your neighbor and ask them to buy their waterfront property, which they're going to charge you what you charge for waterfront property in Alexandria, or you could just take dirt and rocks and throw it in the river, and you can make your own brand new waterfront property. And so between those two things, there's this big push right around the revolution, in the years following the revolution, to what we've been calling bank out, as sort of fuels this expansion of the town. And so one of the ways we see that are these wharves and cribs or piers that get built, and then eventually the landowner or the surrounding landowners figure that they could just fill in around them. The wharves get buried as you extend new wharves out into the river. And then in 200 years, when you excavate the site to put in parking garage and condos, you come across things like this. On the site, we also found more than a couple artifacts. This is one of them. This is called a FID, and it's a fancy tool that's basically a pointy stick that is used for rope making or nautical splicing and well, there's a word I'm looking for now. I can't. It's not coming to me. But it's a tool that you're using on the waterfront as you work with line and rope. To jump down the waterfront, sort of off the map, we're going to go to Ford's Landing. This is what Ford's Landing looks like today. Again, it's now waterfront condos and townhomes. Before the I'm making up the date now, early 1990s, I think is 89, 90. This thing was here. This is a Ford assembly plant, hence the name of Ford's Landing. And even before Ford's Landing, the site was submerged. It was underwater. It's not terribly often that we're able to go back into the archive and find photographs of the things that filled in our waterfront. But Ford's Landing is two exceptions. I want to point out these flat bottom barges up here that are sort of pulled up into the shallow mud flats. And then whatever this thing is here sticking up out of the water. And then this is another photo that I apologize. This is the best quality I've got, but sometimes this is what's available to you. Very clearly here in the cove, underneath what's now Ford's Landing, is the remains of a ship. And so before they went and constructed these new homes, archaeologists got in and took a look at any cultural resources, any archaeological resources that were still buried there. And they came across a treasure trove of maritime archaeology. Here you have, again, these are basically they're fancy shoreline retention devices. They're just wooden walls that hold soil back. They came across a raceway for a shipyard or a shipway. And essentially, if you look at the photo there on the bottom right, you're using these to hold your ship together, hold it up and stable while you're constructing it. Numerous ship pieces and parts. Here are some oarlocks recovered from the excavations. Not one, not two, not three, not four, but actually 5 separate barges under that block. This one's my favorite, if you can have a favorite archaeological barge, because this one, if you look closely, actually got wedged underneath of one of these bulkhead walls. And if you look really closely, you can see that somebody came along with a saw and tried to saw this barge free, and then gave up because it's a Herculean feat to saw a barge free that's stuck under a retaining wall. And then they just flattened the side and filled the cove in around it. They also found this small wooden boat. This is probably best described as a bateau, which is just a fancy French word for a small boat. And the remains of a keeled vessel, probably a 19th century, they call it a tugboat, something like that. You can see the bow of the ship and some of the frames exposed there. To my knowledge, most of this is still extant under Ford's Landing, only in a couple of instances did they need to drive any piles through it. And so the barges and those two ships, one boat and a ship, theoretically should still be under there. So 100 years from now, 200 years from now, when the future archaeologists dig up that site again, maybe they'll see them. To flip-flop back to the other side of the waterfront, we're going, I think, which one is in my way? 4 blocks up to the north, up towards Arlington. We get to the Alexandria Canal. So here's the canal center. I want to say today, but these photos look like they were taken back in the 80s, the 90s. What year is this? I have to go back and check what year this is. This is after the excavation of the mouth of the Alexandria Canal, after the construction of the canal center. And you can see that they've integrated the historic canal into the built environment. Here's a photo from the Civil War that shows the tide lock to the canal. If you're really sharp-eyed, you'll see a small little boat tucked up in here. During the war, they used the aqueduct bridge it's in Arlington, up in Roslyn, just to the left of the Key Bridge. They blocked it off and they used it as a pedestrian bridge throughout the war. So the reason this is marshy and grassy is because there's no water coming down from Arlington to feed the canal. And so archaeologically, when this construction came through, they went looking for the mouth of the canal, the tide block. And sure enough, this ginormous stone block constructed lock was still there. This again is Maskell Ewing. This is his map of the path of the Alexandria Canal, snaking through Alexandria across 4 Mile Run, through Arlington, more or less along the path of US 1 today, up and over through Roslyn, up into Georgetown. A couple years ago, we had some more work done, this time not directly on the waterfront, but there was redevelopment on this block up here. And this sort of large feature here labeled canal was referred to as the turning basin. And so the canal was sort of constructed in 1.5 or maybe 2 phases. The first was to dig the canal down to Alexandria as far as Montgomery Street. Montgomery Street is this one right here. And then once that was constructed and finished by about 1843, traffic could come down the canal, reach the turning basin, unload here at Montgomery Street, turn around and go back to Georgetown. And then the next phase was to dig a series of locks down to the Potomac River, linking the mouth of the Alexandria Canal down here with the other end of the canal up by Georgetown. And so in the interim, this turning basin was the sort of the turning point. It was the end point for a while. And so when archaeology happened on this block, sure enough, more or less right where it was supposed to be, we came down on evidence of the turning basin. So you can see this is sort of how urban archaeology goes frequently. You've got parking lot to break through and then layers and layers of really not nice soil to dig through. And so you can see sort of this urban clay fill over here, this really jumbled soil up here. And then you have these really thin deposited layers of sort of organic fill and clay comprising sort of the depth of the turning basin. This is sort of what we're talking about, canal barges. It's an animal towed, maybe 90 feet long, 15 or 20 feet wide. And you're using this tow path to walk from Georgetown down to Alexandria. A while ago, I went looking through some old aerial photographs. This is a 4 Mile Run right here, prior to it being channelized by the Army Corps of Engineers. This is either what's now US 1 or one of the train bridge or the metro bridge. I have to check which one this is. But as near as I could tell, these these blobby looking blobs are what's left of the Alexandria Canal barge fleet. After the canal closes, there's not a lot of there's not a market for canal going vessels that don't have engines, they don't have steam engines, they don't have sails. There's not a lot of places you can take these. And so my best guess is they were used to sort of try to manage water and floods along 4 Mile Run. And a lot of this has probably been obliterated when 4 Mile Run was channelized. But I have hope that somewhere it's there underneath some of the riprap. Coming back onto the map, we're going to talk what's underneath Windmill Hill Park. And so Windmill Hill Park today looks like this. It was just sort of revitalized with sort of this living shoreline around here. It used to be this horrible concrete seawall bulkhead kind of thing. But part of this process was some waterway management down here at this little stream outlet, and the construction of this pedestrian bridge over it along the foot of, I want to say this is Gibbon Street. And so one of the tools we have at our disposal is a digital historic atlas that combines all sorts of modern geospatial layers with historic maps and other historic data sets we have available to us. And so when I start looking through, you start seeing things like this down in that project area. 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 will look very much like barges or ship hulls, sort of pulled up along the waterfront, submerged in the shallow mud flats, and then just sort of left there to rot. And sure enough, if you pull up some of the early USGS topo maps, you get this little symbol here, which is one of my favorites to see on a map, because this denotes some kind of underwater obstruction, or hopefully it's a shipwreck. And so when they went in to install this pedestrian bridge and some of the shore retention, well, I forget what the engineers called this stuff. These rocks that basically hold back the slope. Sure enough, there is underneath that bridge at least one, if not two, of these what we think are early 20th century barges. And so these are sort of utilitarian work craft that were probably fairly ubiquitous up and down the Potomac River, just as work boats. We had somebody who knows even more than I do about maritime archaeology, and specifically ships and ship construction, to take a look at this. And I think it was exciting. I thought this was super cool. I didn't like having to be knee deep in the Potomac River, but this guy was fairly dismissive of our barge. And so if the experts say that this is ubiquitous and not historically significant, I guess that's okay. Again, luckily, I think only one or two of these rocks needed to impact this barge, and the vast majority of it is still intact underneath this bridge. All right, so now my two favorites. These are two of the most recent excavations on the waterfront. I've lost track of time being in my basement for the last year and a half now. It feels much more recent than I think it is. So this is probably 2016 now. Redevelopment at 220 South Union Street, which at the time was this lovely brick warehouse. It was demolished, and now if you go down to the waterfront, there's this lovely boutique hotel down there. And so underneath this hotel, they wanted to build underground parking. And in Alexandria, if you're going to build underground parking, that requires ground disturbance. And one of the zoning ordinances, sort of the enabling legislation for what our office does, says that if you need to do ground disturbance and you're going to impact potentially significant archaeological resources, then our office has a say in how that happens. And so there's sort of a sliding scale depending on your impact and what we think may or may not be there. But in this case, they were obliterating the entire footprint of their site. And it probably had some of the most significant historical or archaeological resources on the early waterfront. And so archaeologists were on site basically to monitor every backhoe scoop that they did. One of the coolest things we found was this warehouse right here. In 1755, the trustees of the town told John Carlisle to build this warehouse, and they're not explicit, but if you read between the lines, as near as I can tell, what he's doing is this warehouse is supporting General Braddock through the French and Indian War as he's going out towards modern day Pittsburgh. And so this warehouse is receiving all kinds of food and plates and all the stuff that's coming into an early mid 18th century colonial port is docking and being unloaded here at this warehouse. And so this is a plat from 1788. There was a land dispute over probably a grand total of 5.5 linear feet here. This landowner was quibbling with the city about where this boundary should be. And because of that, we have this and maybe one or two other maps that show a lot of the built environment down during the 18th century. And so this map shows this really crooked, as far as buildings in our city go, crooked warehouse down here. Some of it's in the road, some of it's in the water. And sure enough, when archaeologists got down, that warehouse was still in the ground. As an archaeologist, when you tell people that, I found a building at work today, usually what you mean is you found slightly different colored dirt. That's where a building used to stand. And if you're standing on site and you point to it, you say, oh, there's a building there. And people, they look at you and they nod very politely, like, yes, sure. If you say there's a building there, I believe you. That just looks like dirt to me. But in this case, the archaeologists actually found what was left of a building. You can look at the sills and the floor joists, even up to vertical posts and wall studs in some places still survived. And so that was phenomenal being able to find that. This whole building is sitting up on a stone foundation. In the center where the beams come together is another stone foundation. In our infinite wisdom, we decided to record this stone pier here, disassemble it by hand. And these stones are all sitting in a city warehouse. Our brilliant idea is that when it comes back, when the warehouse comes back, we disassembled it and sent it for conservation, is that we would be able to reassemble this stone foundation exactly as it was in the ground, and put these warehouse timbers back on top of it. And so time will tell if that was a smart idea or not. This is the Mac Lab across the way in Maryland. This is their curator, Nicole Daub, who's rapidly telling us to come get our timbers. This site at 220 South Union Street was interesting for a couple of other reasons. If you think back to that Ewing map I showed you at the beginning of the talk from 1845, that original shoreline runs through many of the city lots along Alexandria's waterfront, running all the way back to what's now Lee Street, which was then Water Street, because that's how far back the water went. They named their streets, I guess, as they saw them. And so this site was super cool because we knew from these maps that the original shoreline came through the site. And once the site was excavated down to this depth, that fact became super obvious. This is one of my favorite archaeology photos because here on the right, you can see this really fine, loose, light, it's basically beach sand. If you go to Home Depot and buy sand for a sandbox, I mean, that's sort of the consistency that this stuff over here was. This was fantastic to have to dig. Over here on the left is dense, packed, brought in urban fill that was used to fill in the rest of the city block. And it was not fun to have to dig or touch. But it's not every day that you see such a clear line dividing, marking the original shoreline. One of the things that they did once they built the hotel is that this line continues in the alley to the left, or what side is that? It's the north of the hotel. I think it runs through their lobby, or at least the back hallway, and then onto the other side of the hotel. Archaeologists came down on another bulkhead or pier wall here, and right up against that wall, which is this little line right here, they found a late 18th or early 19th century wooden sailing ship. And this was sort of the largest thing I've ever found to that point in my career. And this is probably my second most favorite archaeology photo. And it is because it makes you ask a couple questions. Number one is, if that's a ship, why is it so far away from the water? And that gives me an opportunity to tell you all about filling in the waterfront and banking out. And then two is, if that's a ship, how come the keel is right here in the center of it? And where's the rest of the ship? And to answer that question, we can look really closely at some of these timbers, and you'll start to see saw marks and axe marks. And in a little bit, I might show you some charring and burning. And so as near as we can figure, people are chopping up these old derelict ship hulls, basically for firewood. And they're chopping them up until they get to the point where there's no more usable material left on them. And they either sink at the waterfront, they become an obstruction to navigation, or they're more useful as sort of pre-made bulkheads. And you'll see that in a second. Here's your crash course in nautical architecture. This is sort of shows most of the pieces. On a lot of these ships, we've got this sort of planking here on the sort of the bottom of the ship. This is the part of the boat that you're putting your barrels and your crates and your hogsheads. This is the part you're walking on down below. If you get told to go man the pumps, this is the part that has water on it that you have to go fix. And this is it's called, I guess, counterintuitively, ceiling planking. Underneath the ceiling planking, you have frames. These are sort of the ribs of the ship. If you think about a ship as a person, depending on which frame you're looking at, depending on sort of where it is along the curve of the ship as the curve goes up the side of the ship. They have different names. The ones that are in the center that straddle the keel are called floors. And then the next one up is, they're sort of all called futtocks. But the creatively named first futtock and the second futtock, third futtock, and fourth and fifth, depending on how many you need to go up the side of your ship. Underneath your hull, your frames, you have your hull planking. And so hull planking are these long, thin, horizontal strips of wood that are nailed onto your frames with these things here called trunnels, or literally they're tree nails. This is sort of your sort of the base layer of the skin of your ship, because on the outside of that, you have this fuzzy layer. Fuzzy is probably the best word to describe it, of what's called oakum or plock, and it's a tar or pitch mixture mixed with horsehair or rope fibers or any kind of fibrous material. And basically what it does is it waterproofs your ship. And not only does it waterproof your ship, but it does an okay job of keeping out shipworms from showing through into your expensive hull planking. And then on the outside of all of that, you tack on what's called sacrificial planking. You can see this piece here has the consistency of maybe not quite a sponge, but it's getting there. You can see all these little holes, and what these are caused by are shipworms, or it's a mollusk that lives in tropical water. It eats eats driftwood naturally, but if it can get its teeth into your expensive 18th or 19th century wooden sailing ship, it's more than happy to. And so the solution is sort of to tack on this cheap, thin, disposable wood planking to the outside of your ship. You allow it to get chewed up and digested by the shipworms. And every 6 months or 2 years, or however often it takes, you pull your ship out of the water, you strip the sacrificial planking off, and you tack new hull planking, new sacrificial planking back on. After a while, the bean counters or the accountants of the British Royal Navy sort of got tired of having to pay for new sacrificial planking for their gigantic fleet. And that's sort of when they start making this transition to copper-bottomed ships into the 19th century, because shipworms can't chew through copper hull. And then lastly, we get down to the very bottom. This is sort of the front part of the keel. The keel is sort of the backbone that runs down the bottom on the outside of the ship. We know from historic records that there is a problem along Alexandria's waterfront, to the point that city council or the trustees had to sort of they had to write legislation to stop people from disposing of their old junky boats up and down our waterfront, because it kept blocking the piers and people's wharves. And so disposing of old unwanted ships was clearly problem enough for city council or the trustees to, what year are we in? I think they're the council then at this point. Legislation like this was needed. And so up and down the waterfront, we find the remains of these ships. And so here's just really quick what we do when we encounter one of these things is, we know it can't stay here. The Archaeology Protection Ordinance allows us to mitigate the impacts to archaeological resources. And if you're familiar with historic preservation law, frequently to mitigate an impact doesn't mean to make the impact go away. It means to document and sort of convert into data the archaeological resource you have. And so what that means is that if they're going to build their parking garage here, this boat needs to be documented, and then it has to go away. And so in this case, we did rounds of sort of traditional archaeological plan view, sort of pen and paper map drawing. Archaeologists from the U.S. Navy's History and Heritage Command came down from the Navy Yard. I think they told their supervisor this was a training activity, that they could do some of this work on land and actually communicate with each other. Some of the stuff that they do underwater and can only talk with their hands. And so they came down for a couple days to help us document the ship, again, standing on dry land where it's easier and they can justify it as a training activity. This is called photogrammetry. And basically, if you think back to your childhood, those Viewmaster goggles you had with those little discs with the pictures in them that make the pictures 3D. This is sort of the digital version of doing this dozens or hundreds of times. And you're able to construct a 3D image of this object from multiple photographs stitched together. They also had subcontractors come by with these terrestrial laser scanners or LiDAR. And basically they're shooting lasers at the hundreds of thousands of millions of lasers at the ship, measuring time of flight and converting that into a distance using the known speed of light. And so when you do that millions of times across the ship, at each of these layers, as you sort of slowly disassemble the thing, we're able to reconstruct in excruciating detail the ship as it was found. And so I think I just said that as we were documenting this thing, we were sort of taking it apart layer by layer and moving it off site into what was formerly transportation or bus depot in the city of Alexandria. And so once it was off site and we didn't have construction managers breathing over our necks, pressuring us to wrap this up as quickly as we could, we were able to spend a little more time documenting, researching, and sort of thinking about this gigantic artifact that we had just recovered from the waterfront. And so we partnered with Texas A&M University with the Conservation Research Lab there. And we packed up all of our ship timbers one week in June a couple of years ago and put them on a truck and sent them down to Texas. And since then, they've been conserving the ship timbers for us. They've been waterlogged for the last, we'll say 200 years, 210 or 15 or 20 years, however long it's been since this thing went in the ground. And so there's a sort of a slow, gradual process of stabilizing the timber. But also they've been digitizing each individual timber for us. And so, if you look at some of these scans, this is fantastic to have this level of documentation. But one, we can't see the undersides of any of these pieces. And two, they've been chopped up and mangled and flattened by an entire city block over the last 200 years. And so being able to scan each individual piece digitally, load those ship pieces into sort of a virtual 3D space, they were able to reconstruct digitally what this vessel would have looked like when it was sailing. And then one of the cool things they did was they used a 3D printer to print each scan timber for us. They had their model maker assemble them into what our ship would have looked like as they would have rested in the original ship. And then they stretched out the rest of the conjectural plan of the ship to give us an idea of sort of what it is we're looking at. And so when this now resides in our museum at the Torpedo Factory, and you really get a sense that my brother jokingly calls these trash ships because they weren't needed anymore. They were chopped up. A good chunk of it was probably burned for firewood, and then they threw it in the water and filled it over with dirt and rocks. And so when we say we found 18th and 19th century ships, we found what's left of the fronts of sides of bottoms of 18th and 19th century ships. And that's not to downplay how significant it is to find ships remains like this, especially on dry land where they can be documented to the degree that we're able to, and sort of without a lot of the challenges that come with having to document them underwater. And then being able to disassemble them and store them and sort of deal with them on dry land as we can, and we have time and resources to do so. So jumping across Duke Street here for a second, as that project wrapped up, the former Washington Post newsprint facility at Robinson Terminal South also underwent redevelopment. So this is a series of, I think, 3 different photographs that have been stitched together down on the waterfront. Here's the Potomac. This is now the site of Hotel Indigo here on this block. This is Duke Street. And then here is now Robinson Landing, formerly Robinson Terminal South. This is was 2 Duke Street. It was a standing pre-Civil War structure. Now I think they've renumbered it to 10 Duke Street. And so it's still there if you go down there after this talk. And so again, the development plans for this block included condos and townhomes, mixed use first floor retail, the standard Alexandria waterfront redevelopment mix. And again, the plan called for underground parking. And if you are going to build an underground parking garage here along the waterfront, you're going to disturb significant archaeological resources. And so once the cement slab for what was then the brick and corrugated steel warehouse came up, archaeologists working there came down on the remains of a fairly well preserved late 18th century waterfront townscape. As All throughout the site are the foundations of residences and businesses, including a bakery. One of my favorite artifacts that's ever been dug up in Alexandria is this thing. This is a ship biscuit, or essentially it's a piece of hardtack that would have been baked here along the waterfront, loaded onto boats and then eaten out at sea. And so I think there's a lot of jokes to be made about finding this thing archaeologically, that it didn't disintegrate, and it probably has a fairly similar texture and consistency to when it went in the ground. To jump back to that map that showed us that 1755 John Carlisle warehouse, jumping across the street, it shows us a couple of buildings labeled as warehouses, one owned by a merchant, Robert Hoe, and then so now I started saying it, I don't remember what number 3 is. I don't think we found, maybe we did find number 3. But I'm going to talk about number 2 because I have a picture of number 2. And so the remains of these early warehouses were still there under the 20th century warehouse, again with intact floorboards. That gigantic structure there behind there is Pioneer Mill. Pioneer Mill was built in the 1840s and was probably the largest flour mill along the Potomac. It got to the point where it was so large that they had to advertise as far away as South Carolina for farmers to ship their grain, wheat and corn up to the mill here in Alexandria to mill it. And I think what I've heard said is that it was so large and inefficient to run small amounts through it that it just wasn't cost effective to operate the mill, and it went bankrupt and out of business. And again, sure enough, once you get through that 20th century warehouse slab, the remains of Pioneer Mill are still there, were still there under the site. And so this fisheye view here doesn't really do the scale of this thing justice. But it was a gigantic stone foundation in the ground, with these gigantic stone slabs holding up the piers of the building. Archaeologists also came down on the remnants of the historic remnants of the Strand. The Strand didn't exist originally on the original Alexandria town plan. It was sort of the original plan was that if you owned waterfront property, then your property rights go up to the water line, and if you wanted to, you could fill in the river, and that would still be your property. Into the 19th century, what ended up happening is that a couple of they call them pass-throughs or access roads to other parts of the city. This road called the Strand started to sort of become established up and down the waterfront, separating some of these former waterfront properties from the river. It becomes this public access road up and down the waterfront, and that's what sort of this road public area here is. And sure enough, archaeologists came down on it as well. And so if you made me make a list of most significant archaeological sites in Alexandria, this one at Robinson Terminal South, I don't know that we were surprised by how much was still there, but we were pleasantly surprised by how much was still there under the 20th century slab. So again, here's Duke Street, here's Union Street. This here is the Strand coming up to Duke Street. And then formerly there was the Robinson Terminal South Washington Post newsprint warehouse facility here, which interrupted the Strand. Was built on top of the Strand. The new development down there has since reopened the Strand, and it's now a road that goes through again. And then up here you can see where the 220 South Union Street ship, the one that we just talked about, was found sort of parked adjacent to, parallel with the original shoreline for the town. And then down on the Robinson Terminal South site, we dug up 3 more ships. Each one's a little bit different. I'm always amazed by the variety of all of these things, and when you spend some time with them, you start to notice a lot of the differences and the sort of what makes each one unique, and you start to appreciate that these things aren't made on an assembly line. They're built by hand. Sort of this artisanal apprentice master vernacular tradition, and so they're all built basically the same kind of general idea as the first ship I showed you. You've got the ceiling planking in a lot of cases on top of the frames, which are the floors and the futtocks, hull planking on the outside, oakum and block, and then sacrificial planking. Some of them are smaller. This one, the aptly named Robinson Terminal South Ship Number 1, is the smallest of the 4. Some of these timbers, most of these timbers, I think I ran my mouth and I suggested I could carry them all by myself one day, one at a time. But some of them are probably a little heavier than I could do, but they're almost manageable. This ship, if you look closely up at the, I always get bow and stern on this one confused. I think this is the stern up here. It's actually wedged underneath of this bulkhead wall. And if you look around it, are pilings for Pioneer Mill, which was built on top of ship number 1 here. It also has a piece that the Indigo ship didn't have. This is called a keelson. And basically, it's just another longitudinal piece that sits on top of the keel and sort of sandwiches all your pieces together. This is Robinson Terminal South Ship Number 2. It's the ship timbers are probably about the same size as the Indigo ship across the street. You can see the Hotel Indigo is now built in the background of some of these shots. It also has this keelson. It did not have ceiling planking, but what's neat about this keelson is cut into it are these 2 little notches that, as near as the Navy people can figure, were used as mast steps. So your mast would sat down into those holes. And what they told me was that it's not terribly common to have 2 so close together. And what they lean towards when they talk about it is a specific type of rigging called snow, which has sort of a main mast in that foremost one, and then just behind it is sort of a smaller, sort of a half mast that you hang another sail from. This ship was also wedged underneath of 2 bulkhead or wharf walls. If you look here, and you start to get the sense that these were ships for a while. They pulled them into port. They started to strip them. You can see along the one edge here, these are all sort of neatly cut or sawn right along this line. Some of the upper timbers are a little more ragged. But then they get to a point where they figure that either they can't extract any more usable firewood from this complex machine, or it's in its present configuration is more useful as sort of this pre-made movable bulkhead that they can sort of move into position, sink, and then build their new wharf on top of as a part of this land making campaign as they're moving out into the river towards the deep shipping channel. And this is the aptly named Robinson Terminal South Ship Number 3. It is by far the largest of all of the ships we've encountered anywhere along the waterfront, maybe with the exception of some of those 20th century barges, but those are sort of a different beast. This ship was sort of half in the project area and half out, and it was buried so deep, it was sort of buried along what I'm sure was the original slope of the riverbed. It wasn't practical to get, or safe to get down in there to excavate it. And so there was this preservation decision that was made to go ahead and install this 60 or 70 foot deep slurry wall that sort of was needed for the construction of the underground parking through this ship, cutting it 60-40, sort of in and then out of the project area. So some of the ship is still underneath the ground, underneath underneath of Wolf Street. The rest of it was taken out and taken back to our ship's storage facility, I guess is what it is. And so since the 2 or 3 years that this has all happened, we've been able to slowly document each of the ship timbers that comprise these 4 ships, and we're able to digitally reconstruct them. It's a lot easier to do this in a computer than it is to sit there with a forklift or a crane and move each of these timbers in place. And so you start to get a sense that ship 1 and ship 2 here are much smaller than the other ones. You have the full bow to stern on both of these two. Indigo's got a bow, but the stern is sort of lost somewhere back here. And then likewise with Robinson Terminal South ship number 3, we've got the very front of the bow, so the bottom of it where the bow meets the keel, all the way back to where it gets lost into that slurry retaining wall. And now the rest of it's somewhere back there under Wolf Street. And I think this is the last site I want to talk about real quick. This is down now at Jones Point, which is managed by the National Park Service. This is the Wilson Bridge and the Beltway sort of going over the park. But in the early 20th century, it was an active shipyard and then an active ship breaking yard. Some of the World War I merchant marine fleet was constructed here. From the panorama there at the bottom, you sort of get a sense of the scale for how much space and sort of what it is they're doing here. Each one of these is one of these large, massive steel and iron ships. It shows up on some of these early 20th century maps, and if you go down there to the park today, you can still see some of the shipways, these cement slabs that would have supported these large ships. And so let's see, what time is it? Got just a couple minutes. And so throughout the history of doing archaeology in the city, especially along the waterfront, but in a second you'll see not exclusively along the waterfront, we have this maritime history and heritage and remnants of that. Even if modern day Old Town doesn't look like an active industrial maritime landscape, it's definitely built on top of it. And I'm sure if you see you go and visit Alexandria, it's one of the pieces that they play up. And so in the Office of Historic Alexandria, we're sort of tasked with telling some of that maritime story of the waterfront, of ships and warehouses, rope making, all of those maritime industries that would have fueled the economy of early Alexandria. And so there's a couple of sources that either I turn to on a regular basis when doing research that pops up along the waterfront, or are sort of in the front of my brain at the moment that I just want to show you real quick. One of the most useful sources is the historic newspapers we have, because the economy of Alexandria was built as a port, with merchants and farmers coming and shipping their crops, the Navy Yard up the way, knowing which ships are in port, who's coming, who's going, where they're going to, who's the captain on board, who's down the river, who's locked up in ice, becomes very important to the economy in the town. And so when you flip through the newspaper, issue after issue after issue, almost every single day, you get the announcements of the arrivals and the departures here in the port, and a whole bunch of other, sometimes you're not even looking for it, miscellaneous ship news that you can use either to go and track the movements of the specific ship, or to get take the pulse of what's commerce and shipping like here in early Alexandria. And so a while back, we had a volunteer go through a couple of years of the late 18th century newspaper and extract every reference he could find to a ship, what kind of ship it was, who was the captain on board, where it was going to or where it was coming from, and any other pieces that the newspaper told us about. And we were able to make this fairly robust data set of, if my memory serves me, probably 2,000 separate entries that track ship type here on the left here by the volume to each domestic and foreign port. Seasonality, what time of year, excuse me, this is ship type. So you can see the greens and blues are your smaller ships, the sloops and the schooners, and your yellows and your oranges are some of your larger ships, your three-masted sort of full-fledged sailing ships, your brigs, things like that. And you can see that smaller vessels are staying closer to home and larger vessels are going further afield. But again, not exclusively. Down here, he graphed seasonality. If is there a pattern to when ships are going to different places? And then he was able to match up which colonial powers are these ships trading with by volume. And so it's this really neat sort of data-driven research that helps us sort of quantify some of what early ships are doing here in Alexandria. When you work in the office that I do, that's been in the same place for as long as it has been, and as many students have come through and volunteers, sometimes I've been there for 5 or 6 years now, and I still turn over paper and I find new things that just in a filing cabinet or on a desk somewhere. And a while back, this is one of those things. And apparently what had happened was one of my predecessors had a class at GW and sent students down to the National Archives to transcribe customs records from ships coming in from foreign ports into Alexandria. And so when you would come in, just like you do today, you would have to declare what you're carrying. And there are these fantastically detailed lists of not just what they're carrying, but where it came from, the amounts, the kind of receptacle it was in. And it's this fantastic data set that takes up an entire drawer in a filing cabinet from the 18th and early 19th century, detailing ship cargoes and ship cargoes and ship cargoes. And this is one of those things that I come back to from time to time, just to either, again, I'm looking for a specific ship like this one here. This is the schooner Enterprise. I'll talk about it in a second. Or just to sort of get a general sense of what ships and shipping are like. Prior to the Americans keeping track of their own customs records, the British did it for us. I much prefer the way the British did it because they've organized every 3 months into these fantastically neat lists and charts that now reside in England. They were sent back and sort of filed away in the Colonial Office. I also like the way that they spelled Potomac. But again, we've got the remains of so far 4 ships that we've disassembled and stored here in the city over the last couple of years. We know they've come in from, entered Alexandria from somewhere else. And theoretically, if they entered Alexandria during the years that the British were in charge of keeping our records, they should appear up here on the ships entered list. But because they're still here, at some point, they are never entered into the ships cleared list. And so, I've got hope that, as we learn more and more, and, we're still waiting on some dendrochronology to come through, trying to hopefully to tell us how old and what part of the world the ship timbers were cut down in. We can turn to these lists and I hope identify at least 1 or maybe 2 of our ships, depending on what years they go on the ground, not just as an anonymous ship, but give it a name based on some of the information that matches. This is the schooner Enterprise. This is at the front of my brain at the moment. Again, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. There is a surviving logbook that actually comes to us by way of Arlington County. It got entered into evidence as part of an 1805 court case when Alexandria was a part of the District of Columbia. And if I understand it, the chain of custody here, when Alexandria was retroceded back to Virginia, the court records came back with Alexandria County which then became Arlington County. And so this logbook was sort of floating around in some of those court records, got scanned and as microfilm and then digitized. And I think the original lives down at the Library of Virginia, but your court may still have it. Anyway, so the logbook, it describes the 4 separate voyages that the Enterprise takes between 1803 and 1804. And it provides the kind of excruciatingly boring detail that historians love. It tells you all the different kinds of sails on the ship and when they're set and when they're pulled in and when they're repairing sails and how often they're pumping ship water out of the bottom of the hull of the ship. It's giving us their position every day, which allows us to chart the voyages of the schooner Enterprise. One of our volunteers sat down and took their observations of latitude and did a little bit of dead reckoning with their heading position, the wind speed, how fast they thought they were going, and was able to plot for us on this map here where the Enterprise is on any given day during this 1.5 to 2 year span. And then you can go off and go to the newspaper and find these advertisements, or go into, again, the U.S. Customs records, find when the Enterprise is coming in from what's now Haiti and declaring oranges and coffee and French passengers. And it provides a lot of the detail that, when you dig up the bottoms of ship hulls, they're anonymous artifacts that don't speak readily for themselves, but you're able to go and find a ship like the Enterprise. You're able to tell a story about what ships like our ships are doing here as they leave Alexandria and travel the world. And then I think I've got 1 or 2 more real quick. Talking manifests and customs records, Alexandria has another legacy down on our waterfront with the domestic slave trade. Alexandria in the 1820s and 30s became one of the largest centers for the domestic slave trade. One of the most detailed sources to document the forced migration of probably close to 1 million people between sort of through the first half of the 19th century up until the Civil War are these shipping manifests. In order to fulfill the requirements of a law that outlaws the international slave trade, captains would have to fill out these forms listing the names, ages, sexes, and a sort of a general description of each person that they were trafficking. And so for Alexandria, we have dozens and dozens of these manifests listing thousands and thousands of people's names. And they provide us with some of the best detail to try to reconstruct that forced migration. Back in last March, the city purchased 1315 Duke Street, which was the headquarters for First Franklin and Armfield, probably one of the most notorious domestic slave trading firms. And then a series of other domestic slave traders came after them, operating that site up until it was liberated during the Civil War. And so that's been one of the things that throughout the pandemic, and as we're sort of transitioning back into work from the office, that's been sort of occupying a lot of my time, is doing some of the background history on this building, as well as some of the connections to the waterfront, ships and shipping. We know that there are 3 or 4 or 5 at various times ships used almost exclusively to traffic human beings out of 1315 Duke Street. And so I think I'm just going to flip real quick. Those were ships found on Alexandria's waterfront. And I've got maybe 4 or 5 slides here that show you some of my other favorite ship artifacts found just a couple of blocks in the north off the waterfront. And so these are very, very different from full bottoms of ships, but they're archaeological artifacts nonetheless that show us ships and shipping. Some of these ceremonial or commemorative creamware pitchers, stoneware jugs, sort of in this vernacular American tradition. This is not a great photograph, but if you believe me for a second, this is sort of a crude wooden toy boat. another creamware ceremonial commemorative picture, a little lead toy boat. It's probably an inch and a half or so. And then I'm going to leave you with my favorite ship, even with the real ones, is this small wooden toy boat that was recovered from a well on, I want to say this is the 500 block of King Street underneath of where the courthouse is now. And so, it's not terribly hard to imagine as how a toy boat ended up in the bottom of the well a couple of blocks off the waterfront. This is probably my favorite of all of the ships that Alexandria Archaeology has recovered over the last, we'll say 50 years. So I think that's the end of what I have prepared. I think I didn't go too far over. We probably have time for questions.
Great. That was really, really fascinating. We do have a couple questions, and please, folks, continue to add them to the chat room. So Tracy asks, well, she makes the comment that Alexandria's archaeological research funding isn't limitless. How does Alexandria decide what to excavate? Looks like you have a lot to choose from.
So our program, I don't want to say it's unique, but it's fairly unique in that our local archaeology protection ordinance is written into the zoning ordinance, and it's tied into our development process. And I think I alluded to it briefly that if there's ground disturbance in the city that you need a city permit for, the same way if you need a permit for, to get the fire marshal to check off your new building, or stormwater management needs to make sure you've got enough, you don't have too much impermeable surface on your development. The same way, it's into the same zoning process as that if you're doing archaeology, it comes across one of our desks, and my colleague takes a look at it, and we have a fairly good handle through a lot of the tax lists and the historic maps, and some of the other sources, the censuses that we have available to us, about what may or may not be, especially in Old Town, under the ground. And so if we think that there's a significant possibility of intact, significant archaeological resources, the developer has to pay for archaeology to happen. And so it's a balancing act where there's the little voice inside all of our heads that would love to make every developer pay for 100% excavation across the entire city always. But yeah, right, that's not a realistic expectation to set. And there, financial resources aside, archaeologically, as far as data recovery goes, that's also probably not a realistic expectation. There's a point of diminishing returns. And so there's always this balancing act between acknowledging that archaeology gets paid for by development, with the fact that when development happens, and nobody can stop development if development wants to happen, how can we use the ordinance that we have to make sure that if we do lose archaeological resources, we do so in a manner that we're able to record and preserve that knowledge in the first place. And so it's this constant, it's a balancing act is what it is. And it's not easy. And I'm sure we get stuff wrong and stuff gets lost that shouldn't, or we think that stuff may be there and it turns out there's not. And there's a little bit of flexibility built into the process where, if we look at a site and it's all the way out far away from Old Town, and it looks like it's been in the middle of a field for all of time, on the site plan, usually my colleague will say is, call us if you find anything, don't do any metal detecting. And usually that's sort of the end of it. And it's not until you sort of get into Old Town and you start to run into some of those issues where you get whole city blocks coming under redevelopment at the same time, with 2-story deep parking garages that are going to obliterate everything. And it's a balancing act between trying to document and save what you can with the reality that this is what happens.
Wow, true enough. So, should we be surprised that these things are so well preserved? I mean, all the wood seems to be, if it's left in the dirt, then it seems preserved. Should we be surprised at that?
Well, it's ordinarily, you're right. Wood, organics, that kind of stuff doesn't typically survive very long in the archaeological record. It'll turn into a stain in the ground that you scoop out, 1 grain of dirt at a time with a trowel. But because these were all down on the waterfront and deliberately buried on the waterfront, they were all basically underneath the water line, and they were kept waterlogged, stable, and in probably an anaerobic environment for the last 200 years. So all the forces that sort of work to break down wood, whether it's bacteria or fungus or termites or freeze, thaw, a lot of those forces aren't applicable once you have waterlogged wood. And so the same thing happens in wells, in privies and cisterns. Once you get into the really wet, goopy bits of those things, you start to pull out fairly well preserved organics. Things like shoes, and we had a shoe. We had a fairly large piece of one of the keels to one of these three ships from Robinson Terminal South that we disassembled. We brought it back to the warehouse, and we probably moved it a half dozen times. When these things are huge, we have a forklift that we would pick them up and drive them around with. And we probably moved it a half dozen times, and then we had it out one time, and then all of a sudden a shoe fell off of it. And we looked at the shoe on the ground, and it was an early 19th century, maybe, leather shoe. And we looked at it, and we looked at each other, and we were like, is that a shoe? Where did that happen? And it's, it's because they're waterlogged, and, that's sort of one of the gigantic obligations we've had over the last couple of years, is to keep these disassembled, disarticulated wood timbers wet and waterlogged. We were recommended above ground swimming pools as our technical solution to keeping waterlogged wood wet. And so in this warehouse, we've had a couple of open houses, and anybody who's been there can tell you we've got a couple of rows of above ground pools set up with hundreds and hundreds of ship timbers in them.
Wow. Does anyone else have any questions? Or Kathy, should we open up the microphones?
Yeah, I think it's fine. If anybody has any additional questions or comments, you may unmute and put your video on, and you may ask straight questions. So if you want to, yeah, it's good.
So real quick, while that's happening, this question here I see, have we been able to match up any of the wrecks with their owners? And so I sort of answered it, but there are a couple of other ships that are buried along the waterfront that we know are buried along the waterfront that aren't one of the ones I've shown you. There's one that we know is underneath, we reasonably suspect is underneath Windmill Hill Park. And when we were doing the archaeology that turned up that one barge underneath that bridge, we were looking for a ship called the Young Hero that its owners petitioned City Council to bury along their section of the waterfront. And so we actually went looking for it prior to the restoration of that shoreline, but came up empty-handed. We thought we had an idea of where it might be, but got down to the waterline and couldn't go any farther. So, there are a couple out there that we know and we have names for, and we think we know about where they are, and we've got them flagged in case somebody digs a giant hole in Windmill Hill Park in the future. But there are a couple.
Any questions from our audience? That was a very very interesting presentation. And boy, do you know your stuff. And it's just amazing. You would find ships underneath that we don't think, you know, I used to think down in the Aquia area, perhaps there'd be some stuff down there too, but it's pretty amazing, right? In Alexandria, it's amazing what you're finding. And I'm jealous of all the work you're doing down there.
Eliana has her hand up.
Okay.
Eliana, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Do other countries know about this internationally?
Do other countries about us digging up boats, about Alexandria archaeology?
Yeah, like the excavation.
I want to say yes. So you know, we've talked to a couple people. If you follow finding of 18th and 19th century ships under city news, after we dug up these, the city of Toronto was building, I don't know what they were building, convention center or something in downtown Toronto, and they came across a fairly similar ship that I think we've talked to somebody about that. There are places in England that also have parts of their waterfront built on sort of filled in ship remains. There's I'm blanking on the name of the town, but they went to dig an orchestra pit for whatever concert venue hall that they were building, and they came down on another ship that they've gone to great lengths to preserve, just like ours are. And so there's a couple out there that internationally are doing fairly similar things to us.
Yeah. Do you find many military ships here, or is it strictly business and commerce?
I'm torn about that question because, number one, if we found a military ship and we could prove it was a naval vessel, then I wouldn't have to deal with it anymore, and it wouldn't be our problem. The Navy would come down and they would claim it, and then it would go away, and we wouldn't have to think about it anymore. And they would do it all for us. And on the other hand, the Navy would take our boat and wouldn't get to think about it anymore. You know, there's an outside possibility that you know, some of these ships. A while back, I went, you know, to get to that question: are we able to match up any of these ships with names? You know, one of the avenues was sort of it's probably not directly naval, but it's naval adjacent. And so if you go back to the American Revolution, in 1770, I haven't thought about this in a little bit, 1776, the former royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, is basically floating around the Chesapeake with 2 or maybe 3 British Royal Navy ships with him. Wow. And then he's got the word I've seen used is a flotilla of sort of just loyalists. They all get on their sloops and their schooners, and they hang out with Governor Dunmore and his Marines for safety, for protection, because it's not safe to be a loyalist in parts of Virginia at that time. And so Dunmore is floating around the Chesapeake, sailing up rivers, burning people's plantations, threatening to emancipate enslaved people, which is causing all sorts of problems for Virginians. And then the fleet he's with, everybody starts getting sick. I think they had cholera or some other disease like that. They were running low on supplies. They didn't have enough manpower to man all the ships. And so they decided to leave the Chesapeake and split up. Some people went up to Queens to meet with the British Navy up there. Some went down to, I think, St. Augustine to meet up with the loyalists down there. And I think Dunmore went back out to sail back to England. And so before he left, he didn't want these ships to fall into rebel hands. And so depending on which source you read, he burned between 8 and maybe 22 of these vessels down at the mouth of the Potomac on the Maryland side. Oh. And so if you looked really closely at some of those photos, ship number 2, I think especially, was really charred and burned up. And I smelled kind of like a campfire for a while after getting down and disassembling it. And so the question was, why does the ship smell like fire, like burning? And so, we have a known documented instance down at the other end of the Potomac of a small fleet of ships deliberately being burned and sunk on the Potomac right around the same time that Alexandrians start to use burned bottoms of parts of ships along our waterfront. And so, I can't prove anything without doing additional research. But it's, one of those distant possibilities that, if I ever can't sleep at night, I think about, are some of our ships, were they salvaged from that fleet that Dunmore burned in 1776? And so again, I don't know if we'll ever know. I have a list of the names of the vessels a day or two prior to the burning, and I've been on the lookout for a list of the ships that eventually made it to St. Augustine, England, and Staten Island or Queens, New York, to sort of do a before and after to get a detailed list of the ships that burned. But it's, on the grand scheme of priorities, it's one of those things that it'll happen when it happens. So there's all these little connections and threads to pull and avenues to go down, and it provides a really rich sort of research project with a lot of little pieces that reach into all different aspects of Alexandria history. And that's, as an archaeologist, you love to find an object or a site that lets you do that. You have this thing that you can talk about whatever you want to talk about in relation to this thing.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Sammy has one. Go ahead, Sammy. Unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Why would the governor of Virginia burn his ships in the water and not on land?
He didn't bury, I'm trying to remember the exact sequence here. They were, I want to say he grounded them. So he sailed them towards the shore, right to the part where it gets too shallow for a boat anymore, and then burned them. So I don't think they were loose in the middle of the river. They were sort of up against the island that, not fully on land. Maybe you take a running start and get it stuck on the sand as best you can, and then burn it.
Oh.
Going down that path, I got as far as communication between the government of Maryland. It happened on the Maryland side of the river, directing these two guys to conduct salvage operations to save what they could. And I think they saved at least 2 or 3 of the vessels were salvageable and sort of reconditionable, and then to sell whatever they could and use that money towards the revolution, which is, it's one of those threads that I don't ever get over to Maryland as often as I should. But I'm always on the lookout for a graduate student who's looking for a project.
Any other questions this evening?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Looks like that's the load.
Dr. Skolnick, this has been really informative. We really thank you for all your time, all your efforts in putting together this presentation. And it's just amazing what you find when you go looking, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was fumbling around looking for my unmute button. I do have one question, or yeah, I guess it's a question. Ben, you had shown an image earlier in the presentation about, it was an image of like maybe some barges. I think it was along 4 Mile Run or the canal. They were just kind of stacked up, and you suggested or you theorized that they may have been used to shore up support. And I think that you said it was maybe the Army Corps of Engineers or something that may have destroyed those artifacts when they came in and kind of channelized the 4 Mile Run.
Yeah.
So you hear of going way back in history, right? Like the Spaniards, when they conquered Cusco, they just destroyed the temples and melted down these these wonderful temples of gold to make gold bars, right? So, this history of kind of destroying history is centuries old, right? And even we've even got the Army Corps of Engineers, involved in destroying history here.
So I'd have to go back and check the timeline real quick, but my understanding is that this happened just before sort of the key historic preservation law came online in the 60s.
Okay.
And so if this was to happen today, the Army Corps of Engineers would come to Arlington County, to us, and say, hey, we're doing this. What do we need to know? Ideally, that's what would happen. And then we would show them this and would say, well, there's this thing here that we think might be canal barges. Maybe you should take a look at it, or have an archaeologist double check to see if it's still there. And going back to that, and again, historic preservation as it's practiced in this country, again, is a balance. It's not, in this case, it's not that they put in luxury condos and underground parking. They channelized 4 Mile Run to control flooding, which is an attempt to contain property destruction all up and down, not just at the mouth here, but all the way up 4 Mile Run. And so, when being a part of the city government, we're in the same meetings with fire and EMS and the police force and health and human services. And you look around the room and, nobody's going to die if I don't do my job well. On the grand scheme of things, doing archaeology falls towards the bottom of the list of priorities for a local government. And so, given the choice between doing flood mitigation, channelizing work, and preserving these ships, I think even I have a sense of what the priorities are. And I like to think that we do our best to sort of work around what some of those priorities are. Now, that being said, if I'm reading this right, and I've got the map lined up the aerial photograph lined up the right way, some of these might still be under the shoreline. So some of those northern ones up at the top may or may not still be there. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you. And thank you for your time tonight.
Any last questions?
If not, there's my email address at the bottom. Feel free to shoot me a question. I'm more than happy to write back.
Thank you so much for your time this evening. Appreciate it very much. And thank all of you for joining us, and we hope to see you on future AHS events. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.